he developed the concept of racial capitalism from a specific system, a description of a specific system, that is like apartheid or settler colonialism, to a way of understanding the general history of modern capitalism. So building on the work of sociologist Oliver Cox, Robinson's objective was not to analyze the historical and contemporary sort of elements of racial capitalism. Instead, what he wanted to show was how European racism, racialism, and nationalism preceded capitalism. Preceded capitalism. In other words, it existed before capitalism emerged, when it emerged in the 13th and the 15th centuries, between that period. And in doing so, he directly challenged the Marxist idea that capitalism was a revolutionary break from feudalism. Now, capitalism and racism, he says, did not break from the old order, but rather evolved from that old order, from the old feudal order, to produce a modern world system of racial capitalism dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. So as he put it, the tendency of European civilization through capitalism was thus not to homogenize, but to differentiate, to exaggerate regional, subcultural, and dialectical differences into racial ones, okay? And that's within Europe. That's to say that capitalism was racial not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or to justify slavery and dispossession. They didn't have to work that hard to justify slavery because they had slavery within Europe. They didn't have to make it up. I mean, slavery was just like common sense, right? But most importantly, that wasn't the purpose, because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society. The first European proletarians were racial subjects. That's what he's saying. The first European proletarians were racial subjects. They weren't just Africans. They were Irish. They were Jews. They were Roma or Gypsies. They were Slavs. And they were victims of dispossession, victims of enclosure, victims of colonialism and slavery within Europe itself. And in fact, he argues that racialization within Europe was very much a colonial process, okay? One involving processes of invasion, settlement, expropriation, and racial hierarchy. And he reminds us that what drove German colonization, the German colonization of Central Europe, for example, in the Slavic territories, was a racial ideology, the ideology of Herrenvolk, right? And the ideology of Herrenvolk presumed German racial superiority over the Slavs or Central Europeans. And he argues that, modern European nationalism was bound up with these kind of racialist myths, whether we're talking about Herrenvolk or Anglo-Saxonism or Celtism or Aryan and Nordic myths, we can go on. And that history of colonialism begins in Europe itself and continues in Europe well after the New World settler colonialism, well after the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, and it is the principal feature of both world wars. Anyone who studied World War II knows that when the Nazis were talking about living room and taking property, that was about colonial domination over territories that they once controlled earlier and then retook. So Cedric Robinson illustrates this point by examining the shifting and increasingly violent character of English colonization of Ireland in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. So the dispossessed Irish who were not killed were ultimately dispersed and often ended up as indentured servants on ships to the New World or in migrant labor on the English mainland. And it was those historical circumstances of subjugation, of colonialism, those historical experiences that shaped Irish nationalism and determined their relationship with the English working class and rendered them an inferior race. This is way beyond the scope of the talk, but if you read like the first section of Black Marxism, it's about Europe. And my students are like, oh, we don't want to read about Europe. I said, but you got to begin there. You got to begin there because this is where race begins, in Europe, right? In any case, racial capitalism then is not merely a type of capitalism, okay? And I know some of you are undergraduates forced to come here. I know, I could see you. So I'm telling you what to take notes on. Okay, so take notes on this. So racial capitalism is not merely a type of capitalism, say as opposed to like non-racist capitalism. We don't have non-racist capitalism. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a non-racial capitalism.
What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger. I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference in the North and the South. There's just a difference in the way they castrate you. But the fact of the castration is the American fact. If I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why.
Well,
And the future of the country depends on that, whether or not it's able to ask that question.